I see second coming. I see that there is now the coming of the Cooper name again to do some really good work. So, I wanted to come and say that to you, that I think he would feel honored by the man that you have become.
K-Tracks, you're spoiling me.
Welcome back, where we are celebrating 35 years of New Jack City. I'm your host, Matthew J. Cooper. I have another living legend with me today. This man started his career as a journalist. He went on to become an editor at publications such as The Village Voice and Spin Magazine. He's worked with and cultivated the careers of journalists such as Stanley Crouch, Norman Mailer, and Barry Michael Cooper. He's gone on to have huge success as a film producer, producing the likes of Sugar Hill, The Hurricane, and the forthcoming Killing Castro, just to name a few. He is the reason New Jack City made it to the big screen. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the icon, Mr. Rudy Langlais.
Oh, thank you. It's more praise than I deserve, but thank you anyway for your kind words.
I don't think I said enough. How you feeling today?
I'm feeling great, man. I think part of it is to be sitting here with you, because it feels like a coming full circle that you're taking up the legacy and the reins of your dad's work, and I feel honored. I feel like I actually are about to go into the next era.
Yes, sir.
In the legacy of Barry Michael Cooper. So let's honor this one.
Yes, sir. I appreciate that. I appreciate you sitting with me. I want to start with, what was your introduction to media?
My introduction to media was when I was at the Village Voice. In fact, my getting to the Village Voice was part of that introduction, because before I got there, I was offered a job at ABC Sports to create a kind of a 60 minutes sports show. And this was based on work I was doing at a black sports magazine, where we were exploring political, social issues, not just the conventional cliched ways of looking at the lives of athletes. And this was at a controversial era, particularly for black athletes. So ABC offered me a job to produce this weekly 60 minutes like show. And so the bug had bitten by that time, and I would pick it up several years later because I chose to go to the Village Voice instead of ABC Sports.
So can you talk about, I know you told me how my father got into the Village Voice. Can you talk a little bit about your introduction to Barry Michael Cooper?
My introduction was a phone call. On the Village Voice's production schedule was that we closed the issue on a Monday night. It went to press. Tuesday was the day I ran a weekly meeting of writers, my staff writers meeting, and I was senior editor handling what was called front of the book. So all the political writers were who I worked with: Nat Hentoff, Jack Newfield, Joe Conason, Wayne Barrett. These are the great legendary political writers of that time. So on Tuesdays, I would have a meeting of those writers. And then in the afternoon, I came in when no other editors did, because I wanted to take phone calls from people who couldn't get into the Voice. It was very difficult to get in. If either you knew someone or an agent of some kind got you to an editor. So that meant new writers, and particularly black and Latino writers in New York who didn't know anybody at The Voice couldn't get into The Voice. So I came in and I took calls, and I had a philosophy that I would give you 5 minutes. And if you held my interest, I would give you another 5 minutes. And so one of the callers one day was Barry Michael Cooper. And we had a fascinating conversation, and it was clear there was an unusual mind behind this call. So I gave him another 5 minutes, and that turned into, finally I said, look, why don't you come in? I want to meet you. And he came in, and the most unlikely guy ever to walk into the Village Voice came through the door. He was big, he had on fatigues, he had a scraggly face. You know, it sent people running because voice people never saw anybody like that come through the door.
Right.
And so you could see it. People were putting pocketbooks away and they were putting their valuables in their desk drawers. But he came in and we talked for hours. And I realized this was a new writer. This was a new thinker. And so I said, I'm going to assign you your first article. And it was an article about a black DJ, you can call him a DJ, named Frankie Crocker, quite legendary figure who, in a sense, invented what's called black urban radio. And Barry had an interesting approach to how he saw the influence of Frankie Crocker. So I said, I'm going to make you your first assignment, but I'm going to make it not as a spec assignment. I'm going to make it an assignment for money. I'm going to pay you because I want you to know what it's like to work for money, because it comes with obligations. Don't miss deadlines. Don't lie to your editor. And so I made him his first assignment, and that's what started our working relationship.
You know, you talk about the space that you opened up for writers and journalists by giving them, you know, the chance to have a phone call with you, just starting with 5 minutes. We're in a culture now where, like, gatekeeping is a thing. It's a buzzword, but it's also a real thing. How important is that for you personally to have a platform for writers of color and, you know, to be an advocate for people that you truly believe in?
Well, it's important because no one ever did that for me. No one opened the door for me. And even in parts of my career where I looked for mentors to open the doors for me, I often didn't find them. And so I realized how difficult it is because I experienced it. And so that was part of it. The other thing I realized is that there were such extraordinary talents who go, in a sense, undiscovered because no one gives them that first step up, that no one takes that first call. And unless you're in the circle, in the know, in some ways, know somebody who knows somebody, it's almost impossible to get into most places. So that was my commitment, is that I wanted to do something that had not been done for me. And I saw what the difference could be.
Wow. Paying it forward.
Paying it forward.
How do you go from, talk to me about the transition from Village Voice to Spin Magazine?
That transition was a circuitous one. After I left The Voice had been bought by Rupert Murdoch. Murdoch changed The Voice. He began to make it more homogenized. He wanted to change the voices of The Voice. He wanted to synthesize these voices, editors who had great freedom to even discover new writers and to try new things. All of that was being homogenized. And so I was working with a writer, or I'd met a writer named Norman Mailer by that time, who was one of the preeminent novelists and political activists of the 20th century. And he kept saying, why don't you and I work together on film? Why don't we develop some films? And so I decided to leave The Voice to work with Norman Mailer. And I came out to Hollywood for the first time. And I was trying to create a career where I could remain in New York, do my work in New York, but make movies in Hollywood. And I was able to arrange 2 initial productions, or the development of them, but I found it difficult to go back and forth. It was costly. I wasn't making any money. Producers didn't get paid when projects went into development. You get paid when they get made. And so at that time, I got a call from the president of Bob Guccione's company. And he said, we've been hearing about you. Mr. Guccione's giving his son a blank check to start a magazine, and he would like to talk to you about it. And so I came in to meet Bob Guccione for the first time, which was a surreal experience. And he told me exactly that. I'm giving my son a check to start a magazine. It's called Spin. It's a music-based magazine. My son has never started a magazine, but you have worked as in management, so would you consider taking this job? And I was so intrigued by this. One of the things that most intrigued me, besides being in the most bizarre empire I had ever seen, I considered it being in the presence of Caligula, because Guccione lived like that. Mm-hmm. He lived a kind of a Roman baronial kind of existence, was that this was going to give me a chance to take a run at Rolling Stone. Mm. And Rolling Stone had been the standard bearer for music, political magazines, but it had fallen off. And I thought it's possible to reintroduce a certain kind of serious, long-form journalism, introduce new writers. Again, this was always a mandate for me personally. And so I decided, you know what, I want to do that. I want to knock off Rolling Stone. And so that was the impulse for taking the Spin job. And then it turned into a much bigger commitment, because I had only planned to help set up the magazine, bring in new writers initially, and then I was going to leave to go back to Hollywood to work on the movies that I was working on. But the bug was, again, biting, and journalism was in my blood, and so I stayed. And we were able to knock off Rolling Stone.
Wow.
And also introduce new writers. Barry Cooper was one of those who we took to another level as a journalist. People don't know this about him. He was an extraordinary journalist. And this is where he cut his teeth as a journalist, including the story that would begin what became New Jack City. So that became my 3 to 4 year journey back into journalism, but also working with a whole range of new writers.
Before I get into Barry Michael Cooper's Spin story on crack, so prior to Spin, you were producing films?
I wouldn't say I was producing them. I was working to produce them.
Okay.
But I hadn't produced anything yet.
Gotcha.
So that was my duality, was I was working to produce films and I was also running Spin.
Gotcha. Talk to me about my father's piece on crack, how impactful that was at that time, and how that in turn led to the creation of New Jack City.
Well, to tell that story, I have to tell about how your father got fired. He got fired before he even got started, in a way, when I called him to say, I'm over here at Spin now, and he had gotten nowhere at The Voice once I left The Voice. The Voice wasn't interested at that point in black writers. And so I called him. I said, I'm here now. I want you to come and write for me here. And so we had a section called Spins, which were record reviews. And I assigned him, he wanted to do a record review of the new Cameo record. And so I assigned it to him, and he wrote the kind of reviews I intended for Spin to be, which were really just off the wall, unexpected, creative. And his approach to it was to write the review as if he was a corner boy slinging dope, and this was the music that they were slinging dope by on the corner. And it was so inventive because it was so fresh. But the piece came in, and Bob Guccione Jr., the publisher of the magazine, immediately fired him.
Wow.
And it fired him in a very humiliating way, which is he sent around a memo that said no one is to ever assign anything else to Barry Michael Cooper, which I was angry at that, because this was my writer. You have a beef with my writer, come to me. Don't put up a memo for the whole staff. And I said, he didn't deserve this. He was trying something. It's words on paper, wouldn't relent. So I knew I couldn't tell Barry, first of all, because this was all he had. This was his lifeline. And I knew how much it meant to him to believe that he could keep his work going. And I had to keep him I had to keep him in pocket. And so I didn't tell him. And then one day he called me and he said, I have an article. He would always call me with ideas. I have an article for you, and it's about crack. This is now 1985. And I said, crack, what's that? He says, rock cocaine that you can buy for $5. And I said, oh my God. I said, is this real? And he says, yes. And so he told me a few stories. I said, okay, write that. So he wrote the story unassigned, because I couldn't put him on an assignment. I couldn't even have his name show up anywhere, so I had to keep him hidden. And he sent this story in, and I read this piece, and then I decided that day was my staff meeting. I was going to go to the staff meeting, and I was going to read the first page of his article, and I wasn't going to tell anyone up front who wrote it. So I went into the meeting. Bob Guccione Jr. was in the meeting. Everyone is there. I said, I got a story about this thing called crack, and what's that, rock cocaine, da, 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 da. And I said, well, let me read some of it to you. And I read the first page, and everyone demanded that I read the whole story. So I read the whole, never been done, read the whole story in the staff meeting. And at the end of it, Bob Guccione, who was spellbound by this.
Junior or senior?
Senior. This is Junior. Junior was running the magazine. Senior was financing the magazine. And Junior said, he's the one who had fired Barry. He said, who wrote that? And 3 sweeter words never came out of my mouth. I said, Barry Michael Cooper. And everyone was shocked because they knew he had been fired. Can we get this? Can we buy it? I said, well, I don't know. We fired him. And I didn't tell them what was going on behind the scenes the whole time. I said, well, let me see what I can do if you'll even sell it to us. And I went back to him and said, look, we're going to buy it. I didn't tell him the politics. And so we bought the piece. And the piece had such a profound effect because no one had ever heard of crack in the country at that time. Nobody, except locally. If you were in Oakland, if you were in, obviously, uptown, but nobody else nationally. And so we published the first piece. The New York Times pulled a little dirty trick on us because we sent out a press release announcing the article, and the Times took the press release and wrote their own article trying to beat us to the stands. But the piece came out, and it introduced this whole new era of drugs, this whole new drug, which would transform not only the use of drugs, but it would have transformed the culture, because crack changed the culture. It created cultures, it created music to mirror the culture. It created a style of clothing. I mean, it created a language. It created a lot, including movies, as we're going to discuss. And it would lead to other things, too. It created I believe most important of all, it created a real journalist in Barry Michael Cooper. Because he had written something, pure journalism, street reporting, that was quite remarkable, personal, and edgy, his voice. And so he would change the culture. So that's how, that began. And, he would go on to write another piece, which was about the use of high-powered guns in Baltimore. Kids killing kids, we called it. And this would be one of the influences for TV series like Homicide, Life on the Street. Clearly the influence for The Wire was in his reporting, because he lived there by that time. He had moved there from Harlem, and he was living in it. And so he was reporting it, but he also was introducing a new language, the way he uses language, but he was also using the language of the street. So there was an authenticity about it. There was a poetry that he created in creating an amalgam of those two kinds of cultures. And so I think that was the beginning of, what would be a very long shadow that he cast over American culture.
Wow. So how do we make the transition from the journalistic perspective of crack and high-power guns with the youth to Hollywood now interested in making this into a picture?
Well, there were a few other long journeys in between there after those stories, and he would win awards for those stories. It would put his name out into the journalistic community, and it was clear that bigger things were on the horizon for him. So I assigned him a story with another writer about the killing of young black kids in Baltimore child murders. And I sent them off to Atlanta. We had been getting reports, the Atlanta child murders, I think I misstated. We had been getting reports that even though the supposed child murderer had been caught and the case was closed, that there were still unanswered questions. And so I sent Barry and another reporter to Atlanta to begin reporting on that, and then we ultimately stumbled onto a major story. The story had an effect on Barry, and this is, part of what it was incredible about him. He had an enormous heart, a vulnerable heart in many ways, and as he was hearing of the killings of these young kids, it was clearly affecting him. And to the point where at a certain point on a recording of interviews, I heard crying. And I thought it was one of the mothers of a child, and it turned out it was Barry, who was so distraught by what he was hearing, because he was identifying these murdered kids as if they were his own family. And I knew then that this was a different kind of journalist who could be affected. He would never be one who was unaffected by what he was writing. He had a big heart about it. So the next story was, I had been getting reports from friends of mine. I have a lot of friends in Detroit, and they were telling me about this gang called Young Boys Incorporated. And what most interested me was that it had a structure, that it had departments, department heads, divisions, branding, marketing, a structure that if any one element of it was removed, it could simply be replaced by another. And so I thought this was the fulfillment of Henry Ford's dream, the whole idea of how capitalism works and the structure of corporate capital. And so the story I had in mind was that what we're seeing is kind of American capitalism brought to the street and structured that way. So I called Barry and I said, "Look, I'm hearing about this. This is what I'm thinking. I want to send you to Detroit to report on it. And here are the contacts. I had various contacts. He then reached out. He established service, and I sent him. I paid his expenses, but I did something odd, which is that I knew I was getting disaffected by working for Guccione, and I was going to be leaving, so I didn't put his assignment on the books. I left his assignment. I paid all the expenses. I paid him, but I kept his assignment off the books. And so I sent him off to Detroit, and then I did leave. And when I left, I kept in touch with him, but I said, "Look, the piece, you're going to own the piece. So you decide where you want to go with the piece after you finish it." That actually is what allowed for him, when he finished the writing of the story, he called me and he said, "Well, what do I do? Do I give it to Guccione? Or do I?" And I said, "No, you've been trying to get back into the Village Voice. You've been trying to get there. This is the story you should take to them." And so he took the piece to the Voice, and the Voice bought it. That piece became the introduction into the language of New Jack City, because it introduced the culture again, but from a Detroit perspective, crack now taken to a more sophisticated level of distribution. And now here was Barry's voice as a journalist that had been had matured, and he wrote a pretty remarkable piece. That was the piece that first introduced New Jack City into the language and eventually into the culture.
How do you, before I even move on to getting more detailed in the New Jack, where did your managerial skills come from? You know, you talk about, you were leaving, you gave my father the wherewithal to negotiate his own deal, where to take the piece to, whether to spin or advise him to take it back to The Voice. Where did your critical thinking on the business level come from?
Well, I had run a magazine. My career began as, the lowest level of, position in a newspaper. I was a copy boy. Copy boys, when I was a sophomore in high school, were schleppers. We got coffee, we got, we filed pictures, we did all kinds of things running around supporting the team. And so I was doing that, but I then became the editor of the leading columnist at the paper. And so I learned how to work with complicated writers when I was a sophomore in high school. And so I had that ability that I was developing working within a professional environment. I got to see how pros worked. I got to see how the editor of a department ran a department. And I got to see not only in the sports department, but all the departments. So I was absorbing all this managerial exposure that I was getting. And then I was offered a job to actually run a magazine in New York. There was a magazine called Black Sports, and Bryant Gumbel had been the editor. And then he was offered a job in television. So they recruited, and I was the one who they recruited to come in and work at this magazine. I wasn't the editor of it. I was just below the editor. And then they fired the editor and promoted me into that position. So now I had a staff, but I already had my own ideas about how it should run, and I actually didn't think it was being run. I didn't think Bryant was good at journalism. I thought he was great at television, so no disrespect, but I ended up firing everybody. I didn't think that they were up to a standard that I believe the magazine should have held itself to, and then I began to rebuild the staff. So I knew all the departments, and I was able to now build a staff in my own image and then rebuild the magazine in the image that I thought it should have. So I was acquiring management skills, all along. And then when I got to The Voice, I was prepared to manage a large group of writers and to meet deadlines and schedules, because I had to do that both at the newspaper I worked with. It was a daily newspaper. You have to hump on a schedule. The same thing with a monthly magazine. So I was getting all of that experience, and the most important experience was working with writers. I now was learning how to work with different kinds of writers. I was learning how to work with really great Pulitzer Prize winning writers, and then new writers, and writers in between, and writers who could write who you had to edit into looking like they could. I was getting all of that. So I came with all of that experience, that kind of set the stage for running Spin.
Nice. So you leave Spin magazine. Where do you go from there?
Spin, I went, Mailer was after me, Norman Mailer was after me, let's get our movies going. We have other things so I came back to Los Angeles, and I began making moves, getting directors. I had Milos Forman as the director on one movie, set up another movie at Universal, and, going back and forth, working at those films. And at the same time, it was difficult. The business was not an easy business to navigate, And so I met Quincy Jones I had met him when I was at Spin. He had been helpful to me on a couple major stories that we had done, including one about Michael Jackson, where he allowed me to be a fly on the wall during the recording of the Bad album.
Oh, wow.
And I had met Janet, and it was helpful in a major story. We did it when Janet did her breakout first album. And so Quincy and I began working on a film together about a Russian poet that we were both influenced by. Russia's greatest cultural figure is a black poet, Alexander Pushkin. So we were going to be working on that. So that's how I met Quincy. And that kind of started bringing me out to LA on a more consistent basis to work on that film, which required that I arranged for us to go to the Soviet Union.
Oh, wow.
So that's why I was out here, at that time working with him.
So was that your first film about the Russian poet?
That would have been, when you say your first film, we didn't make the movie. We worked on the movie. We developed the movie. We went to the Soviet Union. We had quite a mad time because Armand Hammer, the oil billionaire at the time, most influential man in the Soviet Union, was our godfather. So we were operating at a very high level. The Gorbachevs, who were head of the government at that time, they were our hosts.
Wow.
And so that could have been the first movies that Norman Mailer and I, we were all in development on these pictures. That wasn't my first movie. My first movie was a movie that I made with a director named Lizzie Borden, who's a quite famous feminist filmmaker. And I made that movie with the Weinstein Company. But that was still to come in my history. I hadn't quite gotten there yet.
Mm-hmm. So you're out in Hollywood now, working with Norman, working with you, cultivating the relationship with Quincy. How do you reconnect with Barry Michael Cooper? He has this piece on Young Boys Incorporated. He's doing his thing back at The Voice. How do y'all reconnect?
Well, I stayed in touch with him. When the piece came out, he called me and told me it was going to be there. Actually, no, he didn't tell me it was going to be there. I stumbled across it. But I stayed in touch with him. I knew that, he was, he had gone back to The Voice. That part I knew. I knew he was in the process, but I didn't know where it was. I was involved in my own world at the time. So the reconnection happened when one Friday, I was on my way from the office. I stopped at a newsstand when there were such things, and to buy the paper, I would buy The Voice out here on a Friday. Mm-hmm. And I see the article. I see the piece, and so I bought 5 copies of the Village Voice. You had to pay for it out here. And I took 1 copy up to Quincy Jones' house on a Friday night, 1 copy to Clarence Avon's house, who was his partner in a film company, and I was staying with Quincy's third partner, George Jackson, quite famous producer, and I gave each of them a copy of them. I said, you have this script that you've been trying to develop about Nicky Barnes, famous Harlem drug dealer, and you're not happy with the script you have. I said, this is the writer who should rewrite that script. I said, he lived uptown in Harlem. He knew the world of Nicky Barnes. He knew he'd seen Nicky, grew up in the shadow of his influence. I said, here he's been writing the incredible journalism, with his real street voice. And this is his new article, New Jack City. And so they all read it. They called me on Sunday and said, can we meet him? And so that's when I called Barry and I said, I saw the piece. And, obvious congratulations on getting it across the finish line. I said, but Quincy Jones would like to meet you. And his partner, George Jackson. And so he was, of course, flabbergasted because this was all happening very quickly. And I said, they want to fly you out. and put you up and talk about you rewriting this script that they have, which has been inert. So that was the first reconnection with him, was to let him know that Hollywood was calling.
So what was it about Nicky that, do you know, that they were unhappy with, or they wanted to move in another direction?
The script was just a kind of an assemblage of Nicky's stories, because there was a lot of stories out about Nicky. I mean, Nicky was the most famous, the Harlem outlaws. So there was a lot of reporting. The New York Times had done a famous cover story in which they got Nicky to pose for. So there were a lot of tales of murder, and there were indictments that you could read to kind of see how the police put together cases against him. And all this was just like a pastiche of everything you already knew about Nicky Barnes. It had no sense of Harlem. The writer had never been in Harlem, didn't grow up in Harlem, didn't grow up in the culture. And so it just was a flat kind of story that didn't understand who Nicky was. And so there was just the expression ripped from the headlines. This was just all headlines. This needed a writer who actually knew the subject and had a point of view. And so that's where Barry came in. But the thing was that what Barry did, because Barry had also written the first stories about crack, and so his pitch was not to tell the Nicky Barnes story. His pitch was to update the story, bring it into the 80s, into the era of crack, and the new generation, the next Nicky Barnes, if you will. He kept the NB of it. It became Nino Brown.
Okay.
And
never even connected those two.
That's what he did, among many clever things. So that's the big shift, was Barry pitching that this should be updated and crack should be the backdrop for it, and it should be about the new Nickies. And he used some archetypal things from that original Nicky story, the group that Nicky had around him, Nino, the Cash Money, Boys and Brothers. He used some of the things that Nicky was famous for, the giving away of turkeys on Thanksgiving. These were things that Nicky had done, but Barry used it in a different context. And so that, not only did it change what the original story was, but it gave the movie a title, New Jack City.
Wow. What was Quincy's reaction to the change, like from heroin to crack and changing the whole story?
Well, I think there are two reactions. One of them is, there are people for some reason love tales of depravity. They love street stories. They love to hear about crime and prostitution and drugs. And so there's something titillating. It's why we like gangster movies to a certain extent. There was that, but the other reaction was, this wasn't Quincy's world. This wasn't the world that he knew anything about, or even understood. But he understood that there was something of a new culture to be explored. He was inclined to explore it through classical literary form. So he wanted to take a great Dickens novel and adapt that into a current street story and approach it that way. And so I think that was his inclination, but his partner, George, was from Uptown. George knew the streets to a certain extent. George had been involved in, the emergence of hip hop. He had made Crush Groove as a film. He was working with, hip hop artists and rap artists. So George understood it in a way that Quincy didn't, and it was George who was the real driver of it. And there was a difference in approach, because there was George's approach, which was more hewing towards Scarface, and there was Quincy's, which was more hewing toward Charles Dickens and a classical structure. And so, that created a bit of tension because, they were partners and there had to be a decision which way are we going to go. And so that's the world that Barry was stepping into.
You told me something interesting off camera. I didn't know that Quincy Jones was originally set to direct New Jack City.
He was going to direct it. He had not directed anything. I think there was kind of a bug planted by another director named Hal Ashby, quite famous director who was a good friend of his, who told him that he should direct the story, especially if it was going to be a classical structure. These were Hollywood classicists, so they were, the structure of something in a tale of two cities, some classical reference, because that's to them what was valuable. Can we reset Shakespeare in Harlem and, that kind of thing. And so Quincy was trying to find a way in to it as a director, and I remember when I drove Barry up to his house to meet him for the first time, and the meeting was going to be with him, Quincy, and Hal Ashby, and so they ended up having a very long meeting with these various ideas discussed, and they wanted him to go away and come back and pitch using some classical book as a way in. And Quincy was going to be the director, and Hal kept saying, "Yeah, you should direct this." And so that was the plan. I don't think that Quincy's heart was really in directing, first of all. I think he was maybe drawn toward it because Sidney Poitier had started directing, and so he and Sidney were good friends. But I don't think his heart was in it, and his heart certainly wasn't really in directing this kind of story. And so when a split occurred between George and Quincy, George took the New Jack City project with him. Quincy didn't really mind letting it go because it really wasn't for him.
So New Jack would have been Quincy Jones' directorial debut.
In
another world.
In another world, right. And it wouldn't have been what it was, obviously, because it would have been less under George and Mario Van Peebles' control, and Quincy would have asserted a certain kind of, it would have lacked the edge that it had because the filmmakers brought that edge to it. And so it ended up where it should have ended up.
I sat down with Mario Van Peebles, who did a phenomenal job directing New Jack. I asked him, and I'll ask you, New Jack City is one of the most iconic movies ever. It's the most referenced movie in hip-hop history. As someone, who you brought this to life, essentially, my dad created it, but you brought it to life. You brought it to the big screen, Do you know that you're making history while you're making it? Did you know it can be as big as it became?
No, I don't think anyone thinks that way. I don't know of anything that I can recall where at the moment of it you're thinking, what is it going to be? You're just trying to get through. You're trying to get the reporting done. You're trying to meet the deadline. You're trying to tell the story that you saw, and you're hoping that it has some impact, that it has some effect, whatever the reason was you set out to tell the story. You're not thinking that it's going to have some much bigger cultural impact or life, or that's why you're doing it. You're doing it to tell a story, and very often the story is personal. I think that with Coop, a lot of his stories were personal to him, and he wasn't writing them to change the culture. He was writing them because he had to. he had to get this out. And that getting out of it was painful to him very often because he felt as much as he did. But it was just about getting it out. It was inside of him, and he had to get it out. What happens after that is what happens after that. So
you went on to produce Sugar Hill. Well, you and my father created that together from scratch. How many films total have you produced and been involved in?
Those are two different categories. Produced 6, involved in 60 in some ways. In development, there are films that got away. I developed Hotel Rwanda for 2 years, and that got away. There have been other things that get away. They get away because the company you're with, puts them in turnaround, and you don't control it. Things that get close to the gate and then they fall apart. Things that I've had a hand in where, I was more the connective tissue, introducing people to one another. Denzel's film, Fences, was one. I introduced him to the financiers of that. It wasn't my movie. It was just because he's a friend and I wanted to help with that. So there are films, that I have had a hand in, and films that I wasn't a party to, but, some of my DNA is in there. And then, what every producer knows is that you never know what is actually going to go. So you can't just work on one thing at a time. You have to work on multiple things, or things that I started my career working on that, didn't seem as if they were going to go, and then they come back to life. Two of the very first 2 things I started, years ago, and have now come back to life. And I now have an opportunity to make the first 2 Norman Mailer films that I worked on. So, I've worked on many, though. I worked on dozens of projects, and, they fall into different categories.
When you say sometimes they get away because they go into turnaround, can you explain to the audience what turnaround means?
The turnaround basically is when a company decides it doesn't want to make a film, and it lets it go. It releases it. It can either give it back to the author of it, or they can give it back to the director. Whoever was the originator has a right to get it back for a short period of time to try to make it in a different way. And if you haven't made it after a year in a different way, usually they don't give you another chance. They paid for it. They don't want to be embarrassed if you do make it somewhere else. And so they retain ownership of the material, the screenplay usually that was created, or a book that was bought. So that turnaround is what I was referring to. So some things, went into turnaround. I got them back. I set them up and did, like the film that I'm doing about Miles Davis now was something that I started out at one company, and that company didn't value Miles Davis. And so I took that someplace else. So I've had to do that a few times, where if I really believed in something and I put time into it, I want to keep going. The only thing that can stop you is you. So it's only when I stop that it stopped. So, if I believed in something that started, I don't want to stop until I've exhausted everything I could. So
I know you had the Norman Mailer project coming. You got a project coming I'm super excited about. I don't know what you want to talk about, but do you want to talk about any forthcoming projects that you have coming?
Well, I usually don't like to.
Gotcha.
I consider you family, so I share some things with you. Miles Davis is one. We had Michael K. Williams, who was going to play Miles Davis.
Wow.
And it's heartbreaking because we were a couple months away from starting when Michael K. died, as people probably know, of a drug overdose. So we now have a brilliant actor. Took us several years to find the actor to become Miles Davis after that, and we found someone. So we're doing that. We're doing a picture with Jamie Foxx, where Jamie plays there was a black man who was at the highest levels of the Gambino crime family in the 50s and 60s into the 70s and ran big-time gambling. People don't know that. At the very top, I'm talking about the very top in leadership there. And he would go on to create his own giant footprint in American culture and entertainment. He started a record company, discovered Johnny Nash, who sang I Can See Clearly Now. He produced I Can See Clearly Now. That record company would discover Bob Marley, would sign the Wailers and Peter Tosh and Rita Marley and Jimmy Cliff, and that would lead him to promote Malcolm X's speaking tours leading up to Malcolm's death. It would lead him to break the first black supermodel. It would lead him to have a giant footprint in the culture, even to the younger generation of hip-hop entrepreneurs. He, in a way, more than I think Berry Gordy, set the table for what the independent black entrepreneur in the music business looked like, because he created and owned his own record company, and was producing a certain kind of talent. Gil Scott-Heron was one of those. So, he was responsible for The Bottle, Winter in America, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. He was a cultural curator in the best sense of the word. So we're doing a film about him and that time and his effect, his discovery of Bob and the role that the mob played. Because the mob was the financier. The mob was very much the Gambino family were financing Bob Marley and this guy. So we're doing that film and a few other things. Some series. We're doing more series work now. I work closely with Denzel on various things. There's a war series that we're doing about a company of a battalion of black tank warriors in World War II that liberates a concentration camp. And it's a very emotional story of a people who are not free who liberate a people who are not free. And so we're doing that and a few other things.
Gotcha. I appreciate you sharing that with me. Well, I will say to you as well, I consider you family as well. Not only do I consider you family, you are an icon, a living legend, and I like to give our legends their flowers while they can still smell them. So I have something special for you. Would you mind passing me? Just wanted to give you something to, just a token of my appreciation for being, the great man that you are, the great tastemaker that you are. So I'd like to hand that to you.
Oh, man. Should I open it now or should I save
you can open
it
it now. You can open it now.
Until I go home? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm really touched by this.
You want to show it to the camera?
It's absolutely beautiful.
Yes, sir.
This will sit on my desk. I think that part of what I hope happens through your work in honoring the 35th anniversary of New Jack is also to bring people to discover more of Barry Michael Cooper's work. I think that the impact of he and I were talking about this before his transcending, but he was going to do a kind of an assemblage of his reporting, and he had asked if I would edit this collection, which I was I was just really moved by him asking, because this was now, we were working together as filmmaker, writer, but this was now going back to where we started, to go back to the full body of his journalism, which I think is underappreciated. And so I hope that in the course of this, there can be a way for people to go back and read the cycle. I call it the spin cycle. His article on crack, his piece on the Baltimore murders, his piece on the Atlanta child murders, his New Jack piece. People should read that piece in order to understand, where, if there can be a linkage that you provide to some of his stories.
Absolutely.
And what you're doing. People should read his journalism, because he won awards, some prestigious awards as a journalist. And that was one of his gifts. And you'll see a kind of a modern poet in a way, in the way. And I think that should be inspiring too, to see that, this quality of journalism is what he was a great practitioner. And then, a lot of other work he did at The Voice, was groundbreaking as well. So, I considered it, I remember we were talking, and I don't even know if I said this to you, but, I think more that he had a great impact on my life, more than I had a great impact on his life.
You did tell me that.
And I felt I was put in a place where I could, but the work he did was so much a part of who I am. When I assigned something, I assigned it out of personal reason. I assigned him, I bought crack because I understood, that's the where I grew up in Newark, and so I knew the effect on the worlds that I grew up in of this, and the crack wars would almost claim my mother's life. So this was all personal to me. The murders of these young kids in Baltimore using high-powered guns. My family still lived in Newark, so we had a scourge of that as well. And so I felt that story, the Atlanta child murders story. So these are all stories that I felt, what I felt about my personal point of view about Young Boys Incorporated, and why Barry and us linked on that. And yet, here was a way to realize these things. And so I felt fortunate that he called me that day at the Village Voice. And that he came in, and that we managed to have the long run. So I see the path that my career has taken as having been influenced by him. And that was the honor for me, is that I got to be his editor. I got to be his producer. That to me was that affected me and my work. So I honor him for having come my way.
Man, thank you. Thank you for being an advocate for my father, for the culture, for myself. Thank you for all that you've done and that you continue to do.
Last word?
Last word.
Second coming. I think your dad would be incredibly proud and feel that meaning, what does life mean? I have sons, and I felt that if I could send out into the world sons who were good men and would, in some ways carry something of value, either as family men or as an artist of some kind, or a working man who, had a certain value system, morality, then I had done a good thing. And I think he would feel like he's done a good thing because he sent you out into the world. And so I see second coming. I see that there is now the coming of the Cooper name again to do some really good work. So, I wanted to come and say that to you, that I think he would feel honored by the man that you have become.
I appreciate that. It means a lot coming from you. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. If there's anything else I can do to help you, just let me know.
Yes, sir. The great Rudy Langlais, ladies and gentlemen.